Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our regular council meeting for January 27th at 7 p.m. The recommendation is that we call the meeting to order. I guess it's technically 7:03. May I have a mover? Moved by Councillor Cressman, seconded by Councillor Martin. All those in favor? That carries unanimously. We have gathered in Wilmot Township on the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Mississauga peoples. We want to acknowledge the importance of the Dish with One Spoon Covenant, a peace agreement made between Indigenous nations before the Europeans arrived. It characterizes our collective responsibility to each other and Mother Earth. We should take only what we need, leave enough for others, and keep the dish clean. By acknowledging this covenant and the First Nation, Inuit, and Métis peoples, we are reminded of our important connection to this land where we live, learn, and work together as a community. There are a few additions to this evening's agenda, and they have been noted both in correspondence as well as a special interest delegation and Councillor Wilkinson's motion that will come later this evening. May I please have a mover and a seconder to adopt the agenda as amended? Moved by Councillor Sadhu, seconded by Councillor Wilkinson. All those in favor? That carries unanimously. Are there any disclosures of pecuniary interest? Seeing none, may I have an approval for the previous minutes? I would need a mover and a seconder for the December 16th regular meeting, as well as the January 6th Committee of the Whole and the January 7th Special Council meeting. Moved by Councillor Sadhu, seconded by Councillor Cressman. All those in favor? That carries unanimously. As I mentioned, we do have two specific interest delegations this evening. I'd like to remind all delegations of guidelines for participation. For those who are joining us in person, please proceed to the podium when you are called to speak upon. If you conduct yourself in the following manners, it will result in immediate removal from the meeting, including interrupting councillor, staff, or other delegations, derogatory statements about councillor, staff, and or others, hate speech, or defamatory comments. And one last reminder for delegations, please do not take offense if following your presentation there are no questions from council, as it is council's time to really listen and reflect upon the opinions and ideas shared with us from our community members. And although it is rare, I'd like to remind delegates and members of the public that failure to adhere to appropriate decorum may result in the microphone being muted and or removal from the meeting. And out of respect for all meeting participants, I ask that those in the gallery remain seated unless exiting the chamber and avoid personal conversations or expressions of support or opposition to those speaking in order to allow everyone to hear the proceedings as they occur. Both of our delegates will be speaking on the NIPFL private water system, so I will call upon you once we get to that part of the agenda. Did anybody want to pull items from correspondence this evening? Councillor Wilkinson?
Through the chair, I did read through the correspondence. I'm wondering if potentially we just bring it up when we actually discuss that item. There's some questions in there that I think are warranted.
Sure, you can absolutely reference it at that point. You can bring it up. As for the consent agenda item, would anybody like to remove the consent agenda item 9.1? Okay, seeing none, I would ask for a mover and a seconder for item 9.1. Moved by Councillor Cressman, seconded by Councillor Wilkinson. All those in favor? That carries unanimously. On to reports. So we do have the interim tax levy. And the recommendation is that Council adopt the 2025 interim tax levy bylaw to set the due dates for the interim billing of property taxes for 2025 as described in report COR-2025-04-2025 interim tax levy, and that Council directs staff to commence a communications effort to notify residents of planned changes to tax due dates for 2025 and to encourage increased participation in the Township's pre-authorized payment program for taxes. Just to note, this is simply setting the billing dates, not actually the amount of the final tax bill, in case anyone who's following along is wondering. May I have a mover and seconder to get this on the floor? Moved by Councillor Dunstall, seconded by Councillor Martin. Are there any questions or comments at this time about this? Councillor Cressman.
I guess I know I've asked this previously, but to give a breakdown of what portion of the tax collected is the townships, the regions, and education tax. And I know those percentages will change once we finalize our budget, but is that the intent at some point in time?
Through you, Madam Mayor, to the councillor. I was actually just talking to the team today after I talked to the mayor. And so when our final billing goes out, that's the time that we'll provide that insert, because you're right, that relationship of those percentages will change. And so we'll start planning an insert for that final tax billing that will have that breakdown for 2025.
Okay, very good. Any other questions or comments, councillors? Okay, seeing none, I'll call the vote. All those in favor? That carries unanimously. On to report for special events and facility subsidies, and the recommendation is that council direct staff to continue facility use subsidies and in-kind staff costs for legacy facility bookings by affiliated groups and special events taking place in the township facilities in 2025 as described in the report, and that council direct staff to review the affiliation policy and report back to the committee of the whole in September with details including participation rates, residency, and fees and charges. To get this on the floor, may I have a mover? Moved by Councillor Dunstall, seconded by Councillor Cressman. I will now call on Director Catania to provide information on the subsidies and event report follow-up memo.
Through you, Mayor Sallin, and the council, just on the follow-up with this report, staff did reach out to the three major events that do take place just in New Hamburg there at Norm Hill Park. As you'll see here as well, that there is definitely a big draw when it comes to the attendance there. There's the economic spin-offs that come with that, attending into New Hamburg, and as well just to follow up with some of the other local community groups that do benefit from participating and driving in some funds into their own organizations as well. At this time, staff, if we do receive anything from the New Hamburg Board of Trade with any other, from a business perspective, we will definitely share that with council.
Thank you very much, Director. Questions or comments, councillors? Okay, seeing none, I will call the vote. All those in favor? That carries unanimously. On to item 10.3, and this is the NITFL private water drinking system design approvals. The recommendation is that council receive the report, design approval, and that council direct staff to proceed with the detailed design for replacing the NITFL private distribution water system with a new municipal water main and services that meet current municipal and provincial design and safety standards, including design for service connections for all existing users and properties fronting the proposed water main layout in Northeast Petersburg, Notre Dame Drive, and Snyder's Road East as described in the report, and that council direct staff to proceed with the public consultation process as presented in the report, design approval for detailed design for replacing the NITFL private water distribution system. To get this on the floor, may I have a mover and a seconder, please? Moved by Councillor Cressman, seconded by Councillor Dunstall. We will first go to Director Mollenhuis, ask any technical questions after he's done, then we will invite up our delegates, then we will have our further debate. So on to Director Mollenhuis.
Thank you, Mayor. This report is follow-up from the January 6th Committee of the Whole meeting. It provides further information and carries the recommendations forward from that meeting. As noted, the report includes the engagement plan that was outlined as requested by Council, and so this is a very standard and straightforward engagement plan where we would engage the public at a couple different stages, some being in different formats, but certainly at appropriate milestones and with the appropriate scope that would be beneficial to the public so that they can provide their feedback with the information that we're able to give them at that time. It also outlines some of the additional questions around the EA impacts, the ownership transfer timing, fragmentation, and liability that Council had requested. There's a couple things to note here as well in terms of some information. So there was questions about design costs, and so we looked at the internal resource versus a consulting resource, and so we've outlined that for Council for information. And as well, I will note that it's not subject in this report, but there was a recent announcement about a new funding stream at Roma that we think would be a very appropriate funding source potentially, or a program that we could apply for that might contribute to this type of a project. And it's encouraging to see those types of programs, or at least this one, come back. We haven't really seen funding programs like this In recent times, they've been more associated with growth and with development, and this is more so one that's related to what's called health and safety for water systems. Happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you very much, Director. So we will go to technical questions. Councillor Cressman?
Yes, through you, Mayor, to Director Molyneux. I saw your note on the Roma, well, I heard the Roma announcement, plus I saw your note potentially. Just for clarity, do those grants and programs disappear once the writ is dropped?
So I'm happy to report that my understanding is no, they should not, as that part has already been passed and that announcement has been made. Also explains why we're seeing a lot of provincial announcements from Friday and today. A lot of things have dropped. So it should not impact that as it has been funded. Councillor Dunstall.
Thank you, through you, Mayor. Director, does that mean that there would be some relief to the taxpayers that are involved with this particular?
Through you, Mayor, it's an application-based program. We don't have any real information at this point. The application's open on February 12th, and there are a few information sessions that we plan to sit in on to gain information about what costs would be eligible. To answer your question, yes, there would be some form of benefit, we would say, to funding of the system, but to what scale, I don't know.
Perfect, thank you.
Councillor Wilkinson?
Through the chair, while we're on the topic real quick, I mean, I have reviewed it and looked through. One of the key things to note is that it cannot start any later than September 3rd, or start no later than September 30th. So I think obviously the conversation we're having is prudent in terms of making sure that this is potentially available, right? So something to keep in mind through the discussion this evening.
Okay, any other questions or comments before we invite up our delegations? Okay, seeing none, councillors, I will invite up our first registered delegate on this item, Herb Brenneman. Thank you very much for joining us this evening, Herb, and you will have 7 minutes. As well as if you would prefer to sit down, you're more than welcome to use the microphone there.
Good evening, Mayor and Councillors. Thank you for this opportunity to speak. I would like to begin by making a few inquiries to confirm my understanding of the latest report and discuss some issues. From what I've heard tonight, what I'm about to say perhaps is already answered. From the minutes of the January 6th meeting, Council directed staff to proceed with an in-house detailed design of the drinking water system. Apparently, this process has begun with various stages of design completion dates for public viewing and will take up to a year. Will the design be finished by December 25th so that construction can begin in the spring of 2026? The in-house cost of the design and geotechnical costs are going to be at $195,000. Are these costs part of the overall cost, or will they be additional costs to the household owners? The MDT report suggests various potential upgrades scenarios. 1A, water replacement only with repairs to disturbed areas, and 1B, road urbanization, includes water main replacement plus a change from a rural road cross-section to a semi-urban cross-section that includes curbs, catch basins, storm sewers, boulevards that will drain onto the road and into the catch basins. Numerous properties are below road grade. Will these areas be raised to the road grade level so they can drain into the storm drains? It appears on page 3 of the report that the option 1B is being considered. Who makes those decisions? Do we as residents not have a say on which scenario will be implemented? If scenario 1B were to be proceeded with, then we, my wife and I, as property owners of Lot 40 Deerfield Ave, would like to submit our disapproval of that procedure. If this were to occur, the east side of our property on the corner of Deerfield Ave and Alice Crescent would require a huge amount of fill to raise the township ditch and our property to the level of Alice Crescent. Currently, there is a decline of about 2.5 to 3 feet from road level down to our property survey line abutting township property. Fill would be required at that depth for approximately 70 feet westerly direction from Alice towards the east side of our house, and another equal distance down to the intersection of Alice and Deerfield. This amount of fill would add depth to our recently installed septic system. Who would pay for this reconstruction of our lawn and gardens? We don't need scenario 1B. The current ditch system, catch basin storm sewer pipes that were installed in 1983 work just fine today. The only area currently with a drainage problem now is in front of Lot 34 and 35 at the T intersection of Alice and Deerfield. This problem can be easily repaired by lowering the existing culvert down to ditch level, which then crosses under Alice and drains down the north side ditch of Deerfield into a catch basin. The ditch allowing water to drain down from Redford on the east side of Alice to the Deerfield intersection, where it crosses Alice and drains into a catch basin on the corner of Deerfield and Alice, works just fine. A culvert at 20 Alice allowing the water to cross over into that catch basin would need to be replaced as it is nearly full of dirt. There is no issue to my knowledge with the drainage on the west side ditch of Alice from Redford down to Deerfield. We request that scenario 1B not be implemented, as it would change the entire landscape of our subdivision. All we need is a new, up-to-date water main system and an asphalt road. When this water main construction occurs, will the residents of Notre Dame still be able to get their water by the main running through private properties, or will they be required to connect to the looping system along Notre Dame and Snyder's Road, as recommended by the MTE report? With the looping system, the region township should mandate those property owners to assist in paying for the system regardless if they decide to connect now or at a later date. That is the only way we in the subdivision would ever be compensated. Who installs the new water lines off the main line to individual homes, and is this included in the overall cost or an extra expense to the homeowners? The EA regional survey on water is not expected to begin until 2027 and will take up to 16 to 18 months to complete, which will take us into the middle of 2028. We can't afford to wait that long to replace the system.
1 minute remaining.
Because costs of material and labor only go up. A note of interest, in Saturday's record, the Ontario Government Housing Enabled Water System Fund has given Cambridge $2 million to improve water in Hespeler. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Herb, for joining us. Councillors, are there any questions for our delegate this evening? I'm not seeing any. I do believe some councillors are going to ask your questions to staff, as well as we can get some answers, follow up for your questions that you had directly. But thank you very much for joining us this evening. I will now call on our next delegate, Philip Wendland. Philip, thank you very much for joining us again this evening, and you will have 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mayor, and good evening, everyone. Thanks for having me back again 2 weeks after, or 3 weeks after the last meeting. One of the key points of last week or the other week, I should say, that I made, was about public engagement. And there was a takeaway, and certainly there's some stuff in this agenda that relates to that, which is great. But sort of to prove my point a little bit, on page 8 of 8 of the Infrastructure Staff Services Report, under financial considerations, there is, I'm going to call it even like a throwaway line, or thrown in haphazardly is perhaps better stated, that the region of Waterloo's Class EA consulting costs are estimated at $300,000. I know this isn't the township's costs, but to include this in this report, in this agenda, without any other context, has residents and people that live in our neighborhood going, is this just what the cost is? Are we going to be paying for this? I mean, that's like $5,000 a person. And so 2 weeks ago, Jeff was great at addressing some concerns ahead of time before we even got to the delegates. It eliminated some of the questions we had in our speeches or talks. At the time, I said that would have been good to know ahead of time, and I kind of agree with, I would say this is also the same thing. A number like $300,000, while not that huge compared to $2.5 million for the overall project, it's still 12%. So it's still a fair bit of money. So that's the question, I guess. Public engagement, it's good to see a plan in there. It's good to see some milestones on what that's going to look like. It was good for that to be put in there. I think Jeff's statement, however, I'm just going to pick on it. I don't mean to pick on Jeff, that it's the standard and straightforward public engagement process is fine, except that this isn't like a standard and straightforward township project, I would argue. We're not reinstalling sidewalks somewhere where having a public information center with boards is perhaps appropriate so people can come in and wander around and look and be like, oh, look, it's pretty interesting. Here's what, blah, blah, blah. We had one of these in the fall, which while there was some good information in there, a lot of people were, having conversations. Some people who knew more about specific things were asking really good questions. Some people didn't hear those answers. I know there was an effort at the end of that meeting to kind of have a Q&A and to record some stuff on the Engage WR website. A much better format, in my opinion, and probably that of most residents, is a format where, much like I think it was last March, where the township and the region held the joint session and they went through basically the same thing. The boards were just digital, and they allowed us to ask questions at the end, or in fact during. Everyone sort of had the same level of information. So that's something that I'm just going to say I would like to see. The other thing is a lot of folks, a lot of the neighbors at that meeting in October, they're a bit older and they can't stand for that long. And I'm not picking on anybody, but it's the truth. And a lot of them struggled because there were very few chairs and it was a long time. And then although a Q&A was added at the end, which was great, a lot of them ended up having to leave because they couldn't do anything there. So again, these are the usual steps being taken for most township projects, but I would argue we should do a bit more. And then, the next phase involves, viewing by those affected through online or in person, through an online or in-person format. I would suggest that should read online and in person. And the same reason is that we're going to have so many questions, likely. So walk us through it and kind of go through there. I'd also, much like I don't like the language of standard and straightforward for this project, a statement like that this is to be made available for those affected. I mean, we are affected, but I think we're more than affected. We're severely impacted. And I think as such, some of the language used, I know I'm nitpicking a little bit, but I think that kind of language should be taken out when someone is writing a report like this, because we are just more than affected, I would say, in this case. I see there that Engage WR website is being promoted as a good tool for this. I did notice this morning when I was looking at this that there is, I'm not sure if this was always there, I could be wrong, a place to answer questions, and questions were going to be answered there as well. In an email, and I can ask this offline as well, but I think on January 6th, Jeff had said that the team was looking at spinning up some sort of a questions to answer thread. My main question is that going to be the same as this? Is it going to be separate? And all the questions that the council asked in the last meeting that Jeff was good enough to answer in the agenda, all it states is what those questions were, not the answers themselves. So if it's useful, I can go through and ask those questions again through that form and have those answers be documented. I know it's on the YouTube like fully, but a lot of, it's not the best format for that. I got a minute left. All right, that's good. I don't have that much more. I guess lastly, I will say it is great that staff, and perhaps led by Jeff, are looking at keeping our costs down, so looking at in-house design and stuff like this is great. Hopefully this can be done throughout other things. I mean, there's lots of little items in there and big items. I'm not qualified to even look at half these things, but even things like permits, if you're pulling permits for everyone, it looks to me like there's a standard cost being applied for that number. If we're batch processing virtually the same permit for everybody, I mean, is there not a way to ratchet that down a bit? I know these are small numbers, but if we kind of go through all those things together, we could save us a little bit of money. Lastly, I got 10 seconds. Well, we're not thrilled that this is going on. I've no doubt that you all, and probably in particular Jeff, is thrilled that this is suddenly being foisted on us and we're having to deal with it. So I think, at least I recognize that. That's a big thing. So hopefully as we continue through this project, we can kind of work out some of these kinks and have a good process forward. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip. And I certainly appreciate that you're looking at every dollar and cent. I know we're continuing to do that with the budget, and I think that's really great that you're representing your community and pointing these things out. Councillor Wilkinson does have a comment, I believe.
Through the chair, I just want to say thank you to both delegates and the group from Petersburg that's here. And Phil, please know we understand the gravity of the situation and that this is a big ask, right? So, I certainly don't want to let that go unheard, right? We understand it's difficult, and as much as we're in a position to have to make a decision and help drive it forward, I appreciate that doesn't even compare to what you guys are potentially facing. So I completely understand and sympathize.
And just the other thing I did also want to note, I know Jeff and his team certainly, I appreciate your comments about the language used, and I think it's great feedback that we can make, but I know that their team certainly knows this is not at all an easy situation that you guys are going through. So I'm sure that they will continue to help answer any and all questions as they have been throughout the process.
And they have been, so yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for joining us, Philip.
Thank you, guys.
And councillors, I will open up the debate on this. Councillor Wilkinson.
Through the chair, I'm sorry to go back to maybe some more of the particulars or technical questions, but few good things have been raised, and then referencing the letter as well. To Director Mullenhughes, when we're looking at this, I mean, I would tend to agree with some of the comments we've heard this evening that option 1B is not necessarily popular, and there's obviously increased costs associated with road change, stormwater management, and just really changing the overall feel of the neighborhood. I'm curious, was it considered at all, or can it be considered at all, that we simply don't proceed with designing option 1B, but only design option 1A? Would that result in significant cost savings as well?
Through you, Mary, yes, that could be an option. I would say typically through preliminary design, we would look at the feasibility of including what we would say semi-urbanization, not necessarily urbanization, but rollover curbs and that kind of thing. There was mention about storm sewer, but at this point we don't know whether that's even feasible. There are a lot of detailed questions around that, and certainly that's from an individual level, that's pretty standard at this stage when, we don't have a lot of information to provide. But when staff do go through a design process, they would look to see if that is a feasible option, and then we would look at things like cost in more detail once we know how deep, maybe a sewer needs to be or where an outlet might be if we need to establish land needs or something like that. Then we do that sort of an assessment in the early stage. I would suggest that we'll start the design process looking at storm sewer and urbanization, but then we would very likely, have a conclusion whether or not that would be included when we come to a 30% design stage. So to proceed with one or the other and directing at this point, I don't think is necessary. We can do that assessment through preliminary design and come back to the public process.
Through the chair, thank you. That does answer quite a bit, and obviously there will be continued consultation there. Another concern that's been brought up, and I think one that obviously is still lingering, and it's kind of unclear with regards to the future changes to the system. I mean, I don't think there's any dispute over the fact that the system needs to be upgraded and implemented. However, there are some valid concerns here regarding what if the EA comes back and says the system should be expanded? My question, as I'm not a homeowner there, but my question as a homeowner would be, if I paid for that infrastructure to go in front of my house and now someone new's accessing it, how is anyone compensated for the cost that they had to put in a long time ago or 5 years ago or whatever happens to be? So really the question is there a process for that? And, what would the potential cost be to connect down the road if you're not part of that system at the moment?
Through you, Mayor. So that's a question that would need to be answered when we come to a financial stage and to determine how payback is going to work. Those are questions we can't answer for you today. I know that seems to be a large portion of the questions being asked, but in terms of how we'll say those other costs might integrate or how there might be a payback portion, those are questions that would need to be answered at a later date when we come back to council with things like funding and who's paying what sort of thing. They are appropriate questions, and certainly there needs to be answers to that question, but today is not the day that we can answer that for you.
Councillor Wilkinson for.
Through the chair, thank you, colleagues, but there has been some feedback, and I have heard from residents as well. I do understand that you have a robust public engagement plan here, and it obviously looks really good. My question to you would be, would you consider and will you consider potentially changing the format to a question and answer or even a combination session?
Through you, Mayor, just some background information. So when we held the first session, it was a sit-down presentation and question and answer. We had quite a bit of feedback from some residents that would suggest that they wanted a different format. So we've heard certainly from the other side today, and we've heard that there was an appetite, or there is an appetite for some for the direct Q&A. But we did also hear that from other residents that they weren't in favor of a direct Q&A, and they wanted something more to what we had provided in the second PIC. Both meetings had question and answer periods, and then we also had, we'll say, a project record in terms of questions asked and then the answers that were provided to them. So we do hear this piece about transparency, and I would suggest that what we provided to the public in the second meeting met the same outcome as the first in terms of here's the record of what was asked and here's the answer to those questions. So people did hear the same answers. Are we open to that? I would suggest that when we do public open houses for reconstruction projects, we wouldn't typically do a question and answer period. It would be sort of a sandwich board, where folks could go through and they could look at the direct impacts to their property and then ask those questions specific to their property. In this case, we would be fine with doing a Q&A period. I think it would be beneficial to do we'll say a hybrid of the two, but it should be at the appropriate stage of design and not something like at the 30% stage. So yeah, to answer your question, we would be open to the Q&A component, but we would also need to do we'll say the sandwich board walkthrough, that is a very standard thing that does provide quality information to individual residents as well. And I did want to note for the 30% design, there was a comment about, being available online or in person. So that element is, I guess, twofold. So because it is a schematic design today, we do start to build more information into the design process, and we're able to get some more detail, but not the detailed level that obviously a 50 or 60% design would have. And so what we would try to do is set up, if someone would like to come in and sit down and look at the individual impacts to their property, they can come and do that. If they are able to access it online, then they can do that as well, and they can, ask project staff any detailed questions about the design and how that might impact them. So it really is designed to be sort of an individual, at the early stages, an individual-based process if they wish to partake, and if they don't, they can certainly see us again at 60% to get the more detailed information.
Councillor Cressman?
Yes, I guess the two questions I had related to 1A and 1B, and I think it came up and one of the delegates asked the question, who decides? So that was, I think I'm hearing, at least from the two meetings, that the lower priced option would be the one that people would favor, and I can understand if I was homeowner, that's where I'd be leaning. Generally, when water has gone into St. Agatha and New Dundee, who paid for the reconstruction of the street? Was that the entire tax base, or was it applied to the residents?
Through you, Mayor, I'm not sure we have the appropriate staff here to answer that question. My assumption would be that the residents paid for the water main replacement and any of the areas that would be disturbed as a result of the water main replacement, and then the other portions of the street that if you were in there and already doing the work, so for example, in this case, if we were going to, only affect, let's say 1 meter to 2 meters of the roadway, but we see it a value over there to complete the rest of the roadway, then the portion that would remain would be what I would expect would come from the tax base to pay.
Councillor Wilkinson?
Through the chair, those are some good questions, and glad you asked them. The other question here would be, there was a reference to the Region EA cost and the impact, and there's a number of 300,000 thrown around there. Can you please answer that, or care to comment?
Through you, Mayor, so that's provided for information. The information we have is what's presented in this report. That's a regional cost, and so that is, I would suggest, is a regional matter, and that the residents, if they wish to speak to that, can certainly go to the region to speak to those elements, but we have no say, more or less, in that portion of the project. That is entirely, will be a region process, and those are the estimates that they have at this time for the EA. So I can't really comment any further.
Councillor Wilkinson again?
Through the chair, maybe not to Director Mullen, who's here, I'll give you a brief moment, but perhaps to Clerk Boz. There was mention of potentially getting the Q&A transcribed from the discussion that took place at the previous meeting, or the Committee of the Whole. Is that something that your department could provide over to Director Mullenhuse's department to include on the Engage Waterloo Region site, or what would be the proposal to potentially do that?
Through you, Mayor. So that's something that we can get project staff to, so that the work stays with our department. That's something we can get our project staff to go through and scribe, if you will, and upload.
Yep, Councillor Wilkinson?
Through the chair, I don't know that I necessarily have any other questions. I think, there's a lot of conversation here, but just to reiterate maybe the thoughts and how we've come to this decision at this point, it's really in order to potentially access government funding, and in order to potentially explore any other options and how this may impact you or come down, I think it's very clear through all the Q&A and all the questions, we need some sort of detailed design, and that's the goal here today, is to move forward from that. Obviously, there's a long way to go in terms of determining how it will be paid for, who it will affect, but ultimately the only way to get there is through a design. And I appreciate the staff specifically for looking in-house and saying they have the resources to do it versus having to outsource it, because it's saving approximately $150,000 or more, which is substantial in this case. So thanks to the department for that, and I think that's really all I have to say at this point.
Thank you, Councillor. Any other questions or comments, Council? Okay, seeing none, I will call the vote then. All those in favor? And that carries unanimously. On to our bylaws. The recommendation is that the bylaw as attached to this agenda be read a first, second, and third time and finally passed in open council. May I have a mover for that? Moved by Councillor Cressman, seconded by Councillor Martin. All those in favor? That carries unanimously. And we do have a few notices of motion this evening. The first one being Councillor Dunstall's redistribution of the provincial land transfer tax and GST to municipalities for sustainable infrastructure funding. I will invite Councillor Dunstall to introduce their notice of motion.
Thank you, through you, Mayor. Over 100 municipalities are supporting the Mayor of Aurora in asking that a portion of the land transfer tax and the GST be sent back to the municipalities. At ROMA, which is the Rural Ontario Municipal Association Conference, the #1 complaint from pretty well all municipalities was the shortage of funds for infrastructure. I actually did take that walk. Very quick story. I did have an opportunity to ask the Minister of Housing and Municipal Affairs in front of about 2,000 people if this would be something he would consider, and he ceremoniously said no, and then I had to walk back my walk of shame in front of everyone. However, the very next day we did have a delegation with him, and I had an opportunity to speak one-on-one. What he said to me was, keep going, don't give up. So I'm asking, so I'm asking that we approve this, and that this be sent, our support be sent to Mr. Trudeau or whomever, and Mr. Ford or whomever for their consideration.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Is there a seconder for this motion? Seconded by Councillor Martin. Based off that, I'm going to guess that there's minimal discussion, but would anybody like to make comments at this time? Councillor Wilkinson.
Through the chair, I think it's important to recognize Councillor Dunstall for bringing this forward. It's it's important and certainly a motion that I support. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that, the likelihood of it having an impact is slim, but hopefully, as she alluded to, you plant the seed and hopefully see it grow over time. But, I think we got to continue to pound that drum.
Councillor Cressman.
Through you, Mayor, yes, it certainly surprised me because she certainly was shot down in flames when she asked the question.
Thank you for bringing that up in public. I appreciate that.
In the public forum, but in the private situation, he said, don't stop asking. And I thought it was kind of an interesting response, so that I think he was looking for a groundswell in terms of continuing to request funding for assets. And so I commend Councillor Dunstall for having the walk of shame, but having the intestinal fortitude to come back and ask the same question the next day and see the response.
Any other comments or questions on this motion? Seeing none, I'll call vote. All those in favor, and that carries unanimously. On to Councillor Dunstall's funding support for rural infrastructure notice of motion. I'll turn it back over to Councillor Dunstall.
Thank you, through you, Mayor. I will always take advantage of anything out there that may give us some more money. And one of the things I found quite shocking is that the City of Toronto was given $9 billion for infrastructure. and the rural communities get very little. So I'm asking the Township of Wilmot calls on both levels of government to provide necessary funding to ensure rural municipalities are not overlooked in the future, funding applications recognizing the insurmountable debt facing these communities. And I think with this budget that we're looking at, we can all relate to that. So I'm asking for support for this motion, that we once again go back to the government and ask for additional help.
So that's moved by Councillor Dunstall. Is there a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Wilkinson. Any questions or comments on this one, councillors? Okay, seeing none. All those in favor? That carries unanimously. On to mandatory financial training for elected officials in Ontario. Again, this is Councillor Dunstall's motion, and I will call on her to introduce
I was
it.
very busy, thank you. At the New Hamburg Town Hall, one of the suggestions made was, or they had asked if this council had received any financial training, and my answer to that was no. At which point, CAO Clark did mention that they did do some of that training where he was previously. So this motion is simply to ask, and it's actually, when speaking with the clerk, this is not something that is provincially wide. It is that we get governance training, but not financial training. And when we're dealing with billions of dollars throughout the entire municipalities of Ontario, I think it's important to have that training. So my motion is that financial training be mandatory across all municipalities for any new councils, and that this particular council receive training in the second quarter so that we can apply it to the 2026 budget.
Thank you, Councillor. Is there a seconder for this? Seconded by Councillor Martin. Any questions or comments, councillors? Okay, seeing none, I'll call the vote. All those in favor? That carries. And on to our last notice of motion for this evening, I believe, which is the notice of motion regarding the review of current subsidies and grants with a 5-year reduction plan. I will turn it over to Councillor Wilkinson to introduce their report.
Thank you. Through the chair, I'll just introduce it here quickly, but essentially we reviewed a document that came forward not too long ago commenting on some of the subsidies that we grant to user groups for our facilities, whether that be ice rental or gym rental, so on and so forth. In looking at it, I did also hear from my colleagues that, that there's a desire to obviously continue to fund these things to a certain extent because it helps keep youth engaged or potentially other members of the community engaged. However, I'm also aware that there is a significant appetite among some residents elsewhere that don't necessarily access the facilities or utilize the facilities, and potentially looking at why their tax dollars are subsidizing these users or user groups in the particular case. I think there's a potential balance to be had. And essentially what my motion here intends to achieve is that we start looking at reducing these subsidies over time and potentially phasing them in to lessen the burden on the general taxpayer, which can result in savings in our tax levy and potentially redirect those dollars elsewhere to other programs that may need attention, and thus putting the cost of utilizing our facilities on the user group. So if you use the facility for skating, for pickleball, whatever it happens to be, you may have to pay a little bit more, but it ultimately lessens the burden on the general taxpayer for subsidizing that. So I hope that we can see a phased-in reduction here and ultimately get a report back on what this may net the taxpayer in the end.
Thank you very much, Councillor. So that has been moved by Councillor Wilkinson. Is there a seconder for this? Seconded by Councillor Sadhu. Comments or questions? Councillor Dunstall.
Thank you, Mayor. I actually agree with Councillor Wilkinson on this. I think it's a good motion. What I was going to ask if there is an appetite for an exemption, and that would be for the Ag Society. And the reason I'm asking for that is that because we are a rural community, we certainly have had that brought to the forefront over the course of the last 8 or 9 months. We do have new people that move into Wilmot and have not experienced farm life, and there is a lot of information there. So I do believe that the Ag Society, what they bring to the table for a rural community, I'd ask that they would be exempt. I'm not sure if I can get that, if anyone's willing to do that, but that's my suggestion.
I guess just before we look for a seconder on that amendment, I would have a question of clarification for Councillor Wilkinson of, is the 5% reduction to be 5% to each user group, or you're just talking about the envelope of subsidies that we provide going down by 5%? I'm just wondering, is it going to impact in which way?
Through the chair, my intention here is that it's the funding envelope in total, so that when we look at it, it'll essentially be, it might affect some user groups more than others, but ultimately just seeing that reduction so that we can, again, cut the subsidy over time and start getting back to charging user groups.
Okay.
Yeah, that answered my question. Thank you.
Okay. We'll go to Councillor Cressman.
I read this, excuse me, sorry. I read this motion previously, and now I'm having difficulty bringing it up on the agenda.
Are you on the?
Is it strictly on the amended?
It's on the reposted agenda. So if you go to the calendar.
Councillor Cressman, just while you're finding that, do you mind if I go to Councillor Martin?
Yes,
because
go
he had a
ahead.
question. Councillor Martin.
Through you, Mayor Salonen, I have concerns about this motion. I know that the wording that has been used so far are user groups, but I thought that this would also include groups like the Wilmot Family Resource Center. Have I misunderstood things on that?
I'd look to Councillor Wilkinson for clarity on his motion.
Through the chair, appreciate the question. I think in general what I'm looking at is, yes, I'm talking about subsidies related to user groups and rentals of facilities. I'm also looking at our grant program and looking at scaling that back. I think, again, the intent of this motion is to examine where our tax dollars are going, and I think the general taxpayer, we heavily subsidize a lot of these groups and these events and these rentals. So looking at a phased-in reduction will, and again, pushing this to year 2026 will allow groups to adjust accordingly. I mean, I'm certainly open to amendments if there's a will to put one forward, but I mean, again, I'm looking at saying that the general taxpayer can reduce their subsidy to whether that be grants or rentals or wherever, and redirect those tax dollars to programs that benefit the entire general tax base, which I think is probably more appropriate for a general tax levy.
Councillor Martin for a follow-up.
Yes, so my concern about this, I'm certainly willing to have some conversation about user groups and whether it's a good idea to continue subsidizing certain user groups. I would be open to that kind of a conversation. My concern, if we're considering this in the grants and subsidies, like the Wilmot Family Resource Center, that's the one place where our township supports the food bank. The food bank is local through the Wilmot Family Resource Center. Other funding that goes to the food bank for Waterloo Region, it's my understanding that very few people who use the food bank out, the Waterloo Region Food Bank, are from Wilmot Township. The people using that is here in Wilmot Township. And so that would be an example of some of my concerns about this motion, because it's broad. If we want to look at user groups, that would be something different, but that would be my concern about it.
Okay. I think we're just going to take that as a comment, and we will go to Councillor Cressman.
Yes, thank you, Clerk Boss. Technology bites me again, and I will admit it. Through you, Mayor, to Director Catania, I'm under the understanding, based on the master plan, that you are doing some of this investigation of the user groups already, and rather than mandating a certain percentage because it relates to next year's budget, although I'm sympathetic to the motion, I think I'd prefer you doing your work and returning to council with that information prior to implementing anything specific. And so I guess the question is, when do you expect to have information back to us? At least I was under the impression, maybe I'm wrong, that you were doing some of this background work on, as part of the master plan and would be reporting back to us.
Through you, Mayor Sallin, to Councillor Cressman, correct. We are going to be meeting in early March with our affiliated groups and all of our different community groups, service clubs as well. We want to revisit just based on the subsidy report. We want to discuss more the affiliation policy and just to make sure that we're still in line with things that way and just get some feedback when it comes to even with our rates and showing our municipal comparators. So this will tie it all back in as well with that report. And I know that we had promised from a staff perspective to come back to council in September to have a fulsome report, and as well we can include this notice of motion and the requirements under that as well.
We'll go to Councillor Sadhu as he's not made a comment yet, and then Councillor Wilkinson.
Sorry. Yeah, just a quick comment. I am in favor of this, as it would be interesting to see what the net benefit would be for as far as tax savings for the taxpayers, and having a phased-in approach where we can see it's not a hit year one, but over a 5-year span. And it would be a benefit to see the report back and go through this exercise of seeing if we were to claw back 5% a year, where we would end up. Obviously, not saying this would be set in stone. There is certain user groups or organizations that we could, in theory, choose to not include in this. So as a whole, it'd be interesting to see all of it together. And then if it is something that we move forward with, we can always look at different organizations or user groups separately.
Okay, so we'll go to Councillor Wilkinson.
Through the chair, yeah, I certainly appreciate the comments on this. I think ultimately what I'm looking to achieve here is savings to the taxpayer and lessening the burden on them in general. And ultimately, part of the reason to look at putting this forward early in the year, you know, if this was potentially to be reconsidered in September, you know, we could really impact or shake up what these user groups may be looking at budget-wise, which is why I'm suggesting at this point in time that we start looking at making this amendment for 2026, so that way that these groups can plan knowing that, hey, next year we're going to incur a slightly adjusted cost, and then adjust their cost back to their user groups or their users as necessary.
Councillor Dunstall.
Thank you, through you, Mayor. I support Councillor Wilkinson's motion. However, I was going to ask you, Director Catania, because I do recall we did have a conversation about you doing a deep dive in the entire program. And so I would suggest, because this motion does not take effect until 2026, that we wait until we get the report, and then we can take a look at that, at Councillor Wilkinson's motion.
Councillor Cressman.
And as such, I would enter a motion of deferral pending the report of Director Catania's, and then till that is tabled. Is that enough? Go ahead.
I'm going to look to Director Catania first.
Through you, Mayor Sallin, to council, just want to, with looking at the notice of motion and looking at any type of reduction that would take place in 2026, our fees and charges bylaw, with a lot of our updates to the fees and charges, they really don't go into effect until September 1. So if you're looking at 2026, and if it was, and we use ICE users as an example, they would not see any rate increase until September 1st, 2026. So there is still some time. Obviously, there's some time for consultation, because we want to get ahead of that curve, knowing that if there was any type of increase that they'd have to pay, that gets obviously put onto their participants, and they're able to plan for that, because a lot of their registration happens in the springtime, knowing that they have fall programming.
So we have a mover for a motion to defer pending the report back from staff about the wider affiliation program. Is there a seconder for that? Seconded by Councillor Dunstall. So it would be time and place comments at this point in time. I do just have one to add in, and I would just say in relation to time and place that I think if this is something council is seriously considering, waiting until the September report back, it could really put a lot of our user groups in a questioning position versus now giving direction, and council can always at budget time make changes and reverse back on this decision. So that would be why I won't be voting in favor of the deferral. Any other questions or comments on the deferral that's on the table? Councillor Dunstall.
Thank you, through you, Mayor. Director Catania, you're meeting with all of these groups in March, so there would be no issue with you letting them know that there is a potential of 5% decrease starting in 2026, so they would all have that information. Everyone on that list, you're going to have some kind of conversation with, or some kind of communication with.
Through you, Mayor, to Councillor Dunstall, that's correct. If this notice of motion gets passed, then that's something that we'll definitely be articulating at that March meeting, and anyone that's not participating, we'll make sure that we're in touch with.
And if it got deferred, you would still be having that conversation with them, letting them know that this motion was on the table and that there's a good chance that there will be a 5% reduction.
Through you, Mayor Sullivan and Councillor Dunstall, yes, we, as a staff, we would, when we look at the affiliation policy, we want to also look at impact to users and see about the rates, what they're paying. We just want to get an idea, even if this didn't pass, just to know what that impact would be. And this way, it'll help form our reports so that this way, you know, council can definitely make an informed decision on how to move forward.
Thank you.
Councillor Martin.
Through you, Mayor Sallin, and I question Councillor Dunstall's question to Director Catania because we don't even know if this motion is going to pass. So it doesn't make sense to me to direct Director Catania to inform people that it's going to be a 5% reduction when we don't know if the motion is going to pass.
Okay. I will just again take that as a comment. I think that's a fair point to make. Obviously, we can't redact comments that have been made, though, but thank you for noting that. Any other questions or comments on the deferral then? Okay, seeing none, so we're voting all those in favor of deferring until September with the report back. And those opposed? And that is defeated, so we are now back to the main motion. Any other further discussion or comment at this time? Okay, seeing none, so I'll call the vote. All those in favor? And all those opposed, and that is carried. On to announcements for this evening. The Township has lowered the flags today in solemn recognition of the International Holocaust Remembrance Day. 80 years ago today, Auschwitz, the largest Nazi extermination and concentration camp, was liberated. In 2005, this day was designated as the annual International Day of Commemoration in memory of the victims of the Holocaust. Each year, Canadians and individuals around the world take this opportunity to remember the 6 million Jewish men, women, and children, as well as millions of other innocent victims who were murdered during the Holocaust. Today, we reflect on the dangers of anti-Semitism and recommit to never again. Later this week, on Wednesday, January 29th, the Township of Wilmot will again lower our flags in recognition of the National Day of Remembrance of the Quebec City mosque attack and action on Islamophobia. This day solemnly remembers the 6 lives tragically stolen on January 29th, 2017 during the attack on the Centre Culturel Islamique du Québec. They were fathers, brothers, sons, and friends targeted because of their faith, and we honor their memory and stand in solidarity with survivors and hold in our hearts the families, first responders, and communities forever changed by this devastating act of targeted hate. This day serves as a powerful reminder of the urgent need to combat Islamophobia across Ontario. With that, do councillors have any other announcements? I know that was a little heavy. Councillor Cressman.
Yes, remind you of the Heritage Day that will occur on February the 15th at the New Dundee Community Centre. I believe it begins at 10 and goes till about 2:30, and lunch is available for purchase from the New Dundee Women's Institute. Celebrating Families in Wilmot Township is the title, and the 175th anniversary of Wilmot being incorporated. So
Thank you very much, Councillor, and it sounds like a wonderful event for families to enjoy Family Day weekend. Any other announcements this evening, councillors? Okay, seeing none, I did also just want to note that last week, myself, along with Councillor Cressman, Councillor Dunstall, Councillor Martin, Acting CAO Clark, as well as Executive Officer Carly Pettinger, were all in Toronto at the Roma Conference, which is the Rural Ontario Municipal Association Conference. We had a very successful few days meeting with multiple different ministries and advancing the business of the township in terms of advocating for rural priorities. And I know we're about to head into a provincial election. However, we did feel that certainly, or at least I took away the feeling that rural municipalities are starting to be heard from the provincial government, and hopefully we will continue to see further good announcements come from that. But just wanted to say a big thank you to staff who helped organize, as well as to councillors for being there and helping to advocate. Moving on to the confirmatory bylaw, it's that it be read a first, second, and third time and finally passed in open council. May I have a mover? Moved by Councillor Cressman, seconded by Councillor Martin. All those in favor? That carries unanimously. And adjournment. May I have a mover? Moved by Councillor Cressman, seconded by Councillor Sadhu. All those in favor? That carries unanimously. We will adjourn this meeting and reconvene in 10 minutes for the remainder of our special council budget meeting.